Sometimes the most hardened hearts just need the right reason to soften. In Montana's valleys, an aging rancher who hasn't cried since losing his wife receives an unexpected gift from the sky. When a massive golden eagle drops an injured chick at his feet, the gruff cowboy faces a choice that will change everything. He takes the broken bird home, names it Hope, and nurses it back to health. For months, he tends its wing, not knowing the real healing is happening inside his own weathered soul. But what happens when the day comes to set Hope free? Will the bird fly away, or do something that brings this tough rancher to his knees? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Brennan had lived alone for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, though he'd stopped counting somewhere around the 1-year mark. Not because the pain had dulled, but because keeping track seemed to give it more power than it deserved. The ranch sat in a fold of Montana's Boulder Valley, 100 acres of wind-scrubbed grassland that rolled up against the mountains like waves frozen mid-break. The cabin was weathered pine, built by his grandfather in 1947, with a porch that sagged just slightly on the eastern corner and windows that rattled when the autumn winds came down from the peaks. He was 67 years old, though his hands were older and his heart older still. His face carried the deep lines of a man who'd spent most of his life squinting into sun and weather, and his hair had gone silver years before Emma died. He kept it short, military style, a habit from his years in the service before he'd come home to take over the family land. His frame was still strong, lean, and ropey, with the kind of strength that comes from daily labor rather than any gym, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders now that hadn't been there a decade ago. The ranch operated on routine, and Tom moved through his days with the precision of a man who'd learned that structure was the best defense against emptiness. 5 in the morning, his boots hit the floor beside the bed, Emma's side still smooth and untouched, the quilt pulled tight as if expecting her return. Coffee first, thick and black, made in the same percolator they'd received as a wedding gift 43 years ago. He'd stand on the porch while it was still dark, watching the stars fade and the mountains emerge from shadow, one hand wrapped around the mug and the other tucked in his shirt pocket where he kept Emma's wedding ring. He'd stopped wearing his own ring 6 months after she passed, not because he wanted to forget, but because the paired absence felt more honest than the pretense of completeness. But Emma's ring, that thin gold band worn smooth by decades of her work and touch, he kept close. Sometimes he'd roll it between his fingers without thinking, feeling the weight of it, the way it caught the light. It was a small comfort and a constant ache, both at once. The cabin held her everywhere. The blue curtains she'd sewn the spring before she got sick, the bookshelf organized by her hand, mysteries on the left and histories on the right. The kitchen where she'd taught herself to bake bread, filling the house with yeast and warmth on Sunday mornings. Tom had thought about changing things, moving furniture, painting walls, anything to make the space feel less like a shrine and more like a home. But he never did. Change felt like erasure, and he wasn't ready for that. Emma had been his compass, his true north. They'd met at a county fair when he was 22 and fresh out of the army, and she was 20, working a booth selling her mother's preserves. She had red hair that caught fire in the sunlight and a laugh that made him forget every careful thing he'd planned to say. They were married 8 months later in a simple ceremony at the Valley Church, with wildflowers and promises and a future that had seemed endless. She'd died in their bed on a January morning, the cancer having spread faster than anyone expected. He'd held her hand through the last night, watching her breathe, memorizing the pattern of it, knowing each breath brought them closer to the last. When it finally came, when that final exhale left her and didn't return, he'd sat there for an hour, not moving, not crying, just holding her hand and feeling the warmth slowly leave her fingers. He hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't cried when he scattered her ashes in the meadow where they'd been married, hadn't cried through the long nights that followed, when the silence of the house pressed against him like a physical weight. People in town said he was strong, that he was handling it well, that Emma would be proud of how he carried on. But Tom knew the truth. He wasn't strong. He was frozen. Somewhere, in that last night with her, something inside him had locked up tight, and he didn't know how to open it again. The town of Boulder, population 843, sat 20 minutes down the valley road. Tom went in twice a week for supplies, always on Tuesday and Friday mornings, always parking in the same spot outside Morrow's general store. Pete Morrow ran the place, a barrel-chested man with a white beard who'd known Tom since they were boys. Pete never pushed conversation, just nodded and rang up the purchases, and sometimes mentioned if there was weather coming or if someone had been asking after him. Doc Harlan was different. James Harlan had been the valley's veterinarian for 35 years, and he'd been Emma's friend first, then Tom's by extension. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and an unshakable calm that served him well when dealing with spooked horses or grieving ranchers. Once a month, he'd drive out to Tom's place unannounced, bringing supplies for the handful of cattle Tom kept and staying for coffee. They'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing important, fence repairs, the price of hay, whether the elk were moving early this year. Doc never mentioned Emma directly, but his presence carried a gentle insistence that Tom was still part of the living world, still worth checking on. Then there was Sarah Cullins, who ran the neighboring ranch 3 miles west. She was 62, a widow herself for the better part of a decade, and she'd taken to dropping by with casseroles in the months after Emma died. Tom had tried to discourage it without being rude, but Sarah had a stubborn streak that rivaled his own. She'd leave the food on the porch if he didn't answer the door, and he'd find himself eating it because waste seemed disrespectful to the effort. Eventually, he'd started answering the door, accepting the meals with a quiet, "Thank you," and occasionally she'd stay for coffee. She never asked how he was doing in that pitying way that made his jaw tighten. She just talked about her own day, her own struggles with the ranch, the ordinary challenges of trying to keep a place running when your body reminded you daily that you weren't young anymore. Tom's reputation in the valley was solid, if not warm. He was known as fair in his dealings, reliable when he gave his word, and competent with the work. But he was also known as closed off, a man who kept his troubles to himself and didn't invite familiarity. Before Emma died, he'd been different, quicker to smile, more likely to linger after church services, willing to help neighbors with projects that ran long. Emma had been the social one, the bridge between Tom's natural reserve and the community around them. Without her, he'd retreated to what felt safe, which was solitude and routine. The land itself was his closest companion now. He knew every draw and ridge, every stand of cottonwood, every place where the springs ran cold and clear, even in August. He'd been born in the valley, raised on this same plot his grandfather had homesteaded, and he'd planned to die here. The ranch had seen 3 generations of Brennans, and though he and Emma had never had children, a source of quiet grief they'd learned to carry together, he still felt the weight of that legacy. Someone would buy it when he was gone, probably turn it into a vacation property or split it up for development. The thought bothered him more than he liked to admit. His days followed a pattern worn smooth by repetition: morning coffee and the slow arrival of light, feed for the dozen head of cattle that were more pets than livestock at this point, check the water tanks and fences, ride the property lines on his horse, Ranger, a patient gelding who seemed to understand that their outings were as much about thinking as working. Lunch was simple sandwich, maybe some of whatever Sarah had brought. Afternoons were for repairs, maintenance, the endless small tasks that kept a ranch from falling into disrepair. Dinner, alone, at the kitchen table, often eaten standing up, evening on the porch with coffee gone cold, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Bed by 9, where he'd lie awake longer than he wanted to, Emma's ring pressed between his palm and his heart. It was early October when everything changed. The aspens turned to flame on the mountainsides, and the air carrying that particular crispness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Tom had risen with the sun as always, worked through his morning routine, and saddled Ranger for the weekly inspection of the northern fence line. The ride took him along the base of the ridgeline, through meadows of dried grass that whispered in the wind, past the creek that ran high with snowmelt in spring, but now trickled clear and shallow over smooth stones. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only seemed to exist in Montana, deep and endless, with clouds stacked high over the peaks. Ranger moved with his usual steady gait, and Tom let his mind wander the way it often did on these rides, thinking about nothing and everything, Emma and the land and the slow turning of seasons. He'd noticed the eagle earlier, a golden eagle riding thermals high above the valley, its massive wingspan catching the light. Eagles were common enough in the area, though you didn't often see them this close to the ranch. This one seemed to be following him, circling lower, its shadow flickering across the ground ahead. Tom had just dismounted to check a section of fence where the wire looked loose when he heard the rush of wings. He turned, instinct bringing his hand up, and saw the eagle swooping low and fast, something clutched in its talons. For a moment, he thought it might be hunting, diving for a rabbit or ground squirrel, but then the bird pulled up sharply 20 feet away, hovered for just a heartbeat, and released what it carried. The object hit the ground with a soft thump and lay still. The eagle screamed once, a high, piercing cry that echoed off the ridge, then wheeled away and climbed back toward the peaks. Tom stood frozen, trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. Slowly, he walked toward the small form lying in the grass, and his breath caught when he recognized what it was. An eagle chick, maybe 6 or 7 weeks old, its feathers still downy and mottled, lay on its side in the dirt. One wing was bent at an angle that made Tom's stomach tighten. The bird's eyes were open, dark and aware, and as Tom knelt beside it, those eyes found his and held. There was no panic in that gaze, no thrashing or struggle, just a quiet, terrible trust that made something crack in Tom's chest. The chick made a sound, a small peeping cry, and tried to move its broken wing. It couldn't. Tom had seen plenty of injured animals in his 67 years. Ranch life taught you early that nature was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and that suffering was part of the bargain. He'd put down horses with broken legs, shot coyotes caught in traps, found calves taken by mountain lions and left, half-eaten in the sage. He'd learned to do what needed doing without letting sentiment cloud his judgment. The merciful thing, usually, was a quick end. But kneeling there in the grass, with this small broken bird looking up at him, Tom found he couldn't do it, couldn't snap its neck or leave it for the hawks. Something about those dark, trusting eyes, about the way the mother eagle had delivered her chick directly to him, not dropped it randomly, but placed it deliberately in his path, felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a question, or maybe a challenge. He pulled off his work shirt, leaving just his undershirt against the October chill, and wrapped the chick carefully in the fabric. The bird didn't fight him. It trembled against his chest as he carried it back to where Ranger stood grazing, and Tom felt the rapid flutter of its heartbeat through the cloth, so small, so impossibly fragile. He hadn't held something this delicate since he pushed the thought away and focused on getting the bird secure enough to ride. The journey back to the cabin took 20 minutes, and Tom moved carefully, one hand holding the bundle against his chest while the other managed the reins. Ranger seemed to sense the need for caution, picking his way over the rough ground with more attention than usual. Tom's mind raced ahead, trying to remember everything he knew about birds, which wasn't much. He'd need to call Doc Harlan. The man worked mostly with livestock, but he'd studied wildlife biology before settling into veterinary practice, and he'd know more than Tom did about eagle anatomy. The cabin felt different when he carried the chick inside, as if the presence of something living and needful had shifted the air. Tom cleared space on the kitchen table and unwrapped his shirt carefully, laying the fabric flat so the bird rested on its good side. Up close, in better light, he could see the extent of the damage. The left wing hung wrong, clearly broken somewhere in the middle section. There were no visible cuts or blood, which seemed like a mercy, but the wing itself would need to be immobilized if the bone was going to heal. He thought suddenly of the cedar box in the mudroom, the one Emma had used for storing quilting supplies. It was about 2 feet square and a foot deep, with smooth, sanded sides that wouldn't catch or scratch. He retrieved it quickly, dumped the spools of thread and packets of needles into a drawer, and lined the bottom with an old towel. The chick would need somewhere safe to rest, somewhere warm and contained while it recovered. First, though, he needed to stabilize that wing. Tom washed his hands thoroughly, then searched through the bathroom cabinet until he found the medical supplies Emma had insisted they keep stocked. Gauze, medical tape, a small pair of scissors. He had popsicle sticks in the kitchen drawer. Left over from some long-ago project, they'd have to work as splints. The chick watched him as he gathered materials, its head turning to follow his movements with an alertness that seemed remarkable given its injury. Tom pulled a chair up to the table and sat down, taking a long breath to steady himself. He'd set broken bones before his own finger once, and a ranch hand's arm another time when they were too far from town to wait for help. But this was different. The bones would be tiny, hollow, built for flight rather than weight-bearing. One wrong move, and he could make things worse. He started by gently extending the injured wing, supporting the joint with one hand, while feeling along the bones with the other. The chick made a sound, a small cry of distress, but it didn't pull away. Tom found the break about halfway down the wing, felt the slight give where the bone had fractured clean through. Working slowly, talking to the bird in a low, steady voice, though he had no idea if it helped, he positioned 2 popsicle sticks on either side of the break and began wrapping gauze around them in careful layers. The tape was harder. His fingers felt too large, too clumsy for such delicate work, but he managed to secure the splint without binding it so tight it would cut off circulation. When he finished, he sat back and examined his work. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. The wing was immobilized in a position that looked close to natural, and the chick seemed more comfortable already, settling into stillness rather than that trembling awareness of pain. Tom lifted the bird carefully and placed it in the cedar box, arranging the towel around it for warmth. The chick nestled down immediately, tucking its good wing against its body and closing its eyes halfway, in that way birds did when they were resting but still alert. For a long moment, Tom just stood there looking at it, this unexpected responsibility that had literally fallen from the sky into his life. Then he went to the phone and dialed Doc Harlan's number. The call went straight to voicemail, probably out on a ranch call, so Tom left a message asking him to come by when he had time, saying only that he had an injured eagle chick that needed looking at. He didn't explain how he'd come by the bird. That story would sound crazy even to his own ears. The afternoon passed in a strange suspension of normal routine. Tom found himself checking on the chick every 20 minutes, peering into the box to make sure it was still breathing, still stable. He'd set the box on the kitchen counter near the stove, where warmth from cooking would keep the bird comfortable, and he'd draped a dish towel over half the opening to give it some darkness and privacy while still allowing airflow. He tried to remember what eagles ate. Meat, obviously, but what kind? And how did you feed a chick this young? His laptop sat unused on the desk in the corner. Emma had bought it for him 2 Christmases before she died, insisting he needed to join the modern world, and he pulled it out now, waiting impatiently for it to boot up and connect to the satellite internet. The search results were overwhelming at first, hundreds of pages about eagle rehabilitation and raptor care, most of it technical and dense with terminology he didn't understand. But he read through it anyway, clicking link after link, taking notes on a pad of paper. Young eagles needed protein, raw meat, cut into small pieces. They needed water but couldn't have too much at once or they'd aspirate. They needed warmth and quiet and minimal handling to reduce stress. He was still reading when he heard Doc Harlan's truck pull up outside, the diesel engine's distinctive rattle announcing his arrival before the knock on the door. Tom let him in quickly, grateful for expertise beyond his own improvisation. Doc Harlan was in his early 70s, but moved like a younger man, carrying his worn leather medical bag with the ease of long practice. He nodded to Tom in greeting, but his attention went immediately to the cedar box on the counter. He set his bag down, washed his hands at the sink, and lifted the chick out with a gentleness that made Tom feel better about his decision to try saving it. The examination was thorough and quiet, Doc's long fingers probing carefully, checking the splint, looking into the bird's eyes and mouth, feeling along its body for other injuries. The chick endured it all with remarkable patience, only making soft sounds when Doc manipulated the injured wing to check Tom's splint work. Finally, Doc set the bird back in its box and turned to Tom with an expression that mixed surprise with approval. "You did good work here. The splint's positioned well, not too tight. The break's clean, no compound fracture that I can feel. If infection doesn't set in and the bird doesn't thrash around too much, there's a decent chance that wing will heal." Tom felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "What do I need to do?" Doc pulled out a small bottle from his bag, antibiotics in liquid form, 3 drops twice a day mixed with food. "I'll show you how to feed it. The challenge is going to be keeping it calm and immobile for the next few weeks while the bone knits. Eagles are active birds, even young ones. It's going to want to move, try the wing, test itself. You'll need to keep it confined and quiet." They spent the next hour going through the care routine. Doc showed him how to cut strips of raw chicken into appropriate sizes, how to use tweezers to place the food in the chick's mouth, how to make sure it was getting enough water without overdoing it. He explained about keeping the box clean, changing the towel daily, watching for signs of infection or distress. When Doc finally packed up his bag to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Tom with an expression that was hard to read. "Emma would have liked this," he said quietly. "Her taking care of something that needed help. It was always her way." Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. After Doc left, he returned to the kitchen and looked at the chick in its cedar box. It looked back at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and Tom found himself speaking aloud for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Well," he said, "I guess you're staying for a while. Might as well have a name." He thought for a moment, considering and discarding options. Finally, one settled into place with a rightness that surprised him. "Hope. I'll call you Hope, because Lord knows I could use some." The first week with Hope taught Tom more about patience than all his previous years combined. The chick needed feeding every 3 hours during daylight, which meant Tom's carefully structured routine disintegrated immediately. He found himself setting alarms, waking early to prepare strips of chicken, organizing his day around the bird's needs rather than the land's demands. The feeding itself became a ritual that surprised him with its intimacy. He'd pull the wooden kitchen chair up to the counter where Hope's cedar box sat, position himself at eye level with the bird, and speak softly while preparing the tweezers and meat. Hope learned to recognize the sound of his approach, the scrape of chair legs on the floor, and would lift its head expectantly, beak opening in that demanding way young birds had. Tom discovered he liked talking to Hope. Not the absent-minded chatter he'd sometimes directed at Ranger or the cattle, but real conversation, one-sided though it was. He'd tell the bird about his day, about the fence he'd repaired, or the weather moving in from the west. He'd talk about Emma sometimes, carefully at first, then with increasing ease, as if Hope's patient listening had opened a door he'd kept locked. "Your mamma knew what she was doing, dropping you here," he said on the 3rd morning, guiding a piece of chicken into Hope's mouth. "I don't know how she picked me, but she did. Must have seen something I forgot was there." Hope swallowed the meat and opened its beak for more, and Tom obliged, falling into the rhythm of it, offer food, wait for swallow, offer more. The chick was eating well, growing visibly stronger each day despite the immobilized wing. Its eyes were bright and alert, tracking Tom's movements with increasing recognition. By the end of the first week, Tom had reorganized his entire life around the bird. Morning feeding at 6, before his own coffee. Second, feeding at 9, then noon, then 3, then 6, then a final feeding at 9 before bed. In between, he'd work on the ranch, but differently now, staying closer to the cabin, doing tasks that allowed him to check on Hope frequently. The cattle got their feed, the water tanks stayed full, but the far fence lines went uninspected, and Ranger spent more time in the corral than on the trail. Sarah noticed first. She arrived on Tuesday afternoon with a casserole and found Tom at the kitchen counter, tweezers in hand, feeding Hope with the concentration of a surgeon. She stopped in the doorway, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally something that might have been delight. "Tom Brennan, is that an eagle?" He looked up, slightly defensive. "Chick. Mother dropped it here with a broken wing. Doc said if I kept it quiet and fed it regular, it might heal." Sarah set the casserole on the table and approached slowly, keeping her movements calm. Hope watched her with wary interest, but didn't seem frightened. "May I?" Sarah asked, and when Tom nodded, she peered into the box. "Oh my, it's beautiful. What's its name?" "Hope." The word came out before he thought about it, and Sarah's expression softened in a way that made Tom's throat tight. "Emma would have loved this," she said quietly, echoing Doc Harlan's words from days before. She had such a gentle heart for wounded things. Tom nodded, focusing intently on preparing another piece of chicken. Sarah stayed for coffee after the feeding was done, and Tom found himself explaining the whole strange story, the mother eagle's deliberate delivery, the broken wing, the decision to try saving it. Sarah listened without interruption, and when he finished, she simply said, "I'll bring supplies. You're going to need more than chicken if you're raising a raptor." She was true to her word. Over the following days, she brought raw fish, organ meat from the butcher in town, even mice that her barn cats had caught. "Eagles need variety," she explained. "Different nutrients. I did some reading." The gesture touched Tom more than he could express, this quiet support that asked nothing in return. Doc Harlan came by twice in that first week, checking Hope's progress and adjusting the splint as the swelling went down. He seemed pleased with how the wing was healing, though he cautioned Tom repeatedly that it was too early to know if Hope would fly again. "Birds are resilient," he said, "but wings are complicated. Even if the bone heals straight, there's muscle and tendon damage to consider. Time will tell." Time. Tom had plenty of that, and for the first time since Emma died, the hours didn't feel like something to be endured. They felt purposeful. Every feeding, every small sign of Hope's growing strength, every moment of the bird's increasing comfort with his presence, it all added up to something that felt remarkably like meaning. He started keeping notes in an old ledger he found in the desk drawer, tracking Hope's weight, appetite, behavior. The act of writing it down made it real, made this unlikely responsibility feel less like a fever dream and more like a commitment he was choosing to honor. He wrote about the first time Hope preened its good wing, about the day the chick managed to stand steadily on both feet, about the morning he woke to find Hope watching him from the cedar box with an expression that looked almost affectionate. The nights were different now, too. Instead of lying awake with Emma's ring pressed against his heart, staring at the ceiling and fighting memories, Tom would check on Hope before bed. He'd lift the dish towel covering half the box and whisper goodnight to the sleeping bird, then go to bed with a strange lightness in his chest. He slept better than he had in years, waking naturally to the early alarm rather than jolting awake from anxious half-dreams. On the 8th day, Pete from the general store called just after noon. "Heard you've got yourself a house guest," he said, humor warm in his voice. "Word gets around. Sarah mentioned it when she was buying chicken livers. How's the bird doing?" Tom looked at Hope, who was dozing in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the kitchen window. "Good. Eating like crazy. Getting stronger. Glad to hear it. You need anything, you just call. And Tom, it's good. What you're doing. It's real good." After he hung up, Tom stood for a moment, processing the conversation. People knew. People were talking about it. The thought should have made him uncomfortable, should have triggered his instinct for privacy, but instead he felt something else. Connection, maybe. The sense that he was part of the community again, not through obligation or duty, but through this simple act of caring for something small and broken. That evening, as he fed Hope the day's final meal, Tom found himself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time he could remember since Emma's funeral. It was a small expression, brief and unpracticed, but it was real. Hope tilted its head, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Tom could have sworn the bird understood that healing was happening here in this kitchen, and not just to a broken wing. "You're doing good, Hope," he said softly. "We both are." By the end of the second week, Hope had outgrown the cedar box. The chick was nearly twice the size it had been when the mother eagle dropped it, its body filling out with proper nutrition and its feathers growing in thick and glossy. Tom found himself needing to fashion a larger enclosure, and he spent an afternoon building a pen in the mudroom using chicken wire and scrap lumber. He lined the floor with newspaper and added a natural branch for perching, trying to create something that felt less like captivity and more like recovery. Hope adapted to the new space with surprising ease, hopping around the perimeter and testing the branch with careful balance. The splinted wing remained immobile, but the bird was learning to compensate, using its good wing and strong legs to navigate. Tom watched these explorations with mixed feelings, pride at Hope's resilience, and worry about what would happen when the splint came off and the real test began. Doc Harlan came by on the 15th day to remove the splint. He worked carefully, cutting away the gauze and tape, while Tom held Hope steady, murmuring reassurance. When the popsicle sticks finally came free and the wing was exposed, they both fell silent. The feathers were disheveled, and the muscle looked slightly atrophied, but the bone itself felt solid, no give or instability when Doc gently manipulated it. "Well," Doc said, sitting back, "that's about as good as we could hope for. The bone's knitted clean. Now we see if the bird remembers how to use it." Tom released Hope back into the pen, and they watched as the chick extended both wings for the first time in 2 weeks. The movement was awkward, the injured wing slower and stiffer than its partner, but it moved. Hope flapped experimentally, not enough to achieve lift, but enough to show that neural pathways were intact, that signals were traveling from brain to muscle as they should. Over the following days, Hope worked the wing constantly, as if making up for lost time. Tom would come into the mudroom to find the bird standing with both wings spread wide, holding the position like a stretch, or flapping in short bursts that sent newspapers rustling across the floor. The determination in these exercises reminded Tom of Emma during physical therapy after her first surgery, that same stubborn refusal to accept limitation. The comparison brought pain, but it also brought something unexpected: gratitude. For the first time since Emma died, Tom found himself actively glad to be alive, glad to be present for this small miracle of healing. The feeling was so unfamiliar, it took him a moment to recognize it, and when he did, he had to sit down hard on the mudroom steps, overwhelmed. Hope stopped exercising and hopped over to him, pecking gently at his boot. Tom reached down and, for the first time, stroked the bird's head with one finger. The feathers were softer than he'd expected, warm under his touch. Hope leaned into the contact, making a small churring sound that might have been contentment. "You're healing me too, aren't you?" Tom said, his voice rough. "That's what your mama knew, that we both needed this." He pulled Emma's ring from his pocket and looked at it, really looked at it, for the first time in months. The gold caught the afternoon light coming through the mudroom window, and Tom found himself remembering not the grief of losing her, but the joy of having known her, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, her fierce intelligence and fiercer kindness, the quiet mornings and the comfortable silences, and the 1,000 small intimacies that had woven their lives together. She would have loved Hope, would have been the one insisting they try to save the bird, would have researched care techniques and reorganized the house without hesitation. She would have named the bird something hopeful and meaningful, just as he had, because that was who she was, someone who believed in second chances and the possibility of healing. Tom slipped the ring back into his pocket, but the weight of it felt different now. less like an anchor and more like a touchstone, something to carry with him not because he couldn't let go, but because he chose to remember. That evening, Sarah stopped by with supplies and found him sitting on the porch, Hope perched on the arm of his chair. The bird had graduated from the pen to supervise time in the house, and now seemed content to stay near Tom, following him from room to room like an unlikely companion. "My lord," Sarah said, stopping short, "would you look at that?" Tom felt his face warm, slightly embarrassed at being caught in this moment of obvious attachment. "Bird won't leave me alone, follows me everywhere." Sarah climbed the porch steps and settled into the other chair, moving slowly so as not to startle Hope. "That's imprinting. You're the one who fed it, cared for it through the vulnerable time. In Hope's mind, you're family, maybe even a parent." The word parent hit Tom with unexpected force. He and Emma had wanted children, had tried for years, before finally accepting it wasn't meant to be. They'd made peace with it, had built a full life without that particular joy, but the longing had never entirely gone away. And now here he was, unexpectedly responsible for this fierce, beautiful creature that looked at him with trust and affection. "What happens when it's ready to fly?" he asked quietly. "When it needs to go back to the wild?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Hope preen its wing feathers. "I imagine that'll be hard, but also right. You're not trying to keep it, Tom. You're trying to heal it so it can be what it's meant to be. That's love, not possession." They sat in companionable silence as the sun descended toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Hope dozed on the chair arm, completely at ease, and Tom felt something settle in his chest, an acceptance of whatever was coming, good or difficult, an openness to feeling again, even though feeling meant the possibility of loss. Before Sarah left, she turned to him with an expression that was both serious and gentle. "You know people are going to say you've changed, that you're different than you were." "Am I?" "Yes, you're softer somehow, more present. Emma's death froze something in you, and this bird is thawing it out." She smiled. "It's good to see, Tom. Really good." After she drove away, Tom carried Hope back to the mudroom pen for the night. The bird protested briefly, then settled onto its branch with a soft chirp. Tom stood watching for a long moment, then spoke into the dimness. "I don't know what I'm doing, Hope. Don't know how to let you go when the time comes. Don't know how to be this person who feels things again, but I'm trying. For you, and maybe for me too." Hope tucked its head under its wing, already drifting towards sleep, and Tom headed to his own bed with a lightness that felt almost like joy. November arrived with snow on the peaks and frost that turned the meadow grass silver each morning. Hope was 3 months old now, nearly full-grown, with the distinctive golden-brown plumage of a young eagle and eyes that had deepened from dark brown to amber. The bird was magnificent, and watching it move through the cabin with increasing confidence filled Tom with a pride that felt almost parental. The wing had healed remarkably well. Hope could extend it fully now, the movements fluid and strong, and had begun practicing flight in earnest. Tom had cleared the living room of furniture, creating an open space where Hope could launch from the back of the couch and glide across the room, landing with increasing grace on the mantel or the windowsill. Each successful flight brought that churring sound of satisfaction, and Tom found himself cheering the bird on like a father at a little league game. But success brought complications Tom hadn't fully anticipated. Hope was getting restless, pacing the house and crying at the windows, watching the sky with an intensity that spoke of deep instinct awakening. The bird belonged outside. Tom knew this, but the knowing didn't make it easier. Every time he thought about releasing Hope, his chest would tighten with something that felt dangerously close to panic. Doc Harlan noticed during his weekly visit. He found Tom standing at the kitchen window, watching Hope hop around the porch railing outside, wings spread for balance. "You're going to have to let it go soon," Doc said gently. "It's strong enough now. Ready." "I know." Tom's voice was tight. What if the wing isn't as strong as it looks? What if I release it and it can't hunt properly, can't defend itself?" You're not worried about the wing, Tom. You're worried about losing something you've come to love. Doc's hand settled on his shoulder, solid and warm. I understand, but keeping it past its time doesn't serve the bird, and it doesn't serve you either. Tom nodded but didn't respond, and Doc left without pushing further. But his words lingered, uncomfortable and true. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, wrapped in Emma's old quilt, Hope perched on the railing beside him, both of them looking up at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The November air was sharp, carrying the scent of coming winter, and Tom's breath fogged in small clouds. "Your mama knew I needed you," he said quietly, "but she also knew I'd have to let you go. That was part of it, wasn't it? Learning to open my hands again." Hope turned to look at him, those amber eyes reflecting starlight, and Tom had the strange sensation that the bird understood every word. Maybe it did. In whatever way birds understood such things, maybe the connection between them ran deeper than language, down to some fundamental recognition of shared need and healing. The next morning Tom made a decision. He drove into town and bought supplies, leather, glove, long lead, everything Pete recommended for what he called flight training. If Hope was going to be released, it needed to be done right, gradually, with Tom ensuring the bird could hunt and navigate before letting it go completely. They started in the meadow behind the cabin, Tom with Hope perched on his gloved hand, the long lead secured to Jess's around the bird's legs. He'd lift his arm and Hope would launch, flying in wide circles at the end of the tether, banking and diving, testing its wings against real wind and open sky. The joy in those flights was unmistakable, and Tom felt his heart lift and break simultaneously, watching the bird finally do what it was born to do. Sarah joined them one afternoon, bringing her own pair of gloves. "I used to do falconry," she explained. "Years ago, before Frank died. I know a bit about training raptors." Together, they worked with Hope, teaching it to return to the glove, to respond to the whistled call, to hunt lures that mimicked prey. Hope learned fast, driven by instinct that had only been waiting for opportunity. Within a week, the bird could strike a thrown lure in mid-air, could return to Tom's glove from 100 yards away, could soar and hunt, and everything that made it an eagle. The transformation was breathtaking and terrifying. "It's ready," Sarah said one evening after a particularly successful training session. "Tom, you know it's ready." He did know. But knowing and accepting were different things entirely. That night, he pulled out the old photo albums he'd been avoiding since Emma died and spread them across the kitchen table. Pictures of their wedding, of their years together, of all the moments that had made up a life. Emma laughing, Emma serious, Emma with her arm around him, looking at the camera like she'd just won the lottery. He found a picture from their last summer together, before the diagnosis, before everything changed. They were at the county fair, and Emma was holding a small bird that had flown into the barn tent and stunned itself. She was cupping it gently, her face full of concern and care, and Tom remembered the moment perfectly, how she'd stood still for nearly an hour until the bird recovered enough to fly away, how she'd cried a little when it finally did, tears that were somehow both sad and happy. "You always knew," he said to the photograph, "that loving something meant being willing to let it go, that holding on too tight was its own kind of cruelty." He sat there for a long time with the albums, with memories, with the understanding that Hope had done exactly what the mother eagle had intended, forced Tom back into the world of feeling, of caring, of accepting that love and loss were two sides of the same coin, and both were necessary to being fully alive. The next morning, Tom woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He knew what needed to happen, knew where, and knew that he was strong enough now to do it. The work Hope had done healing his wing was matched by the work Hope had done healing Tom's heart, and both of them were ready for what came next. He spent the day preparing, checking supplies, making arrangements. He called Doc Harlan and Sarah, told them his plan, and accepted their offers to be present when the moment came. He wanted witnesses, wanted people who understood what this meant, who could help him if he faltered. That evening he stood with Hope on his glove, both of them looking toward the mountains. "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow we go to the cliff where your mama probably nests. Tomorrow I give you back to the sky." Hope shifted on the glove, wings spreading slightly, as if in agreement or anticipation. Tom felt Emma's ring in his pocket, felt the weight of 3 years of grief and 2 months of healing, and knew he was going to be okay. Whatever came next, however much it hurt to let Hope fly free, he was going to be okay. Tom woke before dawn on the day of the release, the morning dark and still, and found he couldn't go back to sleep. He made coffee and sat on the porch. Hope perched beside him on the railing, both of them watching the stars fade and the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gold of approaching sunrise. His hands were steady on the coffee mug, but his heart felt like it was breaking and mending at the same time, each beat carrying both grief and gratitude. He'd known this day was coming since the moment the mother eagle had dropped Hope at his feet, had known even as he splinted that broken wing that the whole purpose was eventual flight. But knowing didn't make it simple. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Hope turned to look at him, head cocked in that curious way birds had, and Tom reached out to stroke the feathers on its head one more time. "You worked so hard to heal. You're strong now. Strong enough for whatever comes next." The drive to the cliff took 40 minutes, climbing narrow dirt roads into the high country where eagles nested in the escarpments. Sarah met him at the trailhead with Doc Harlan, both of them bundled against the November cold, their faces showing understanding and support. They'd brought thermoses of coffee and quiet companionship, knowing that sometimes presence mattered more than words. Hope rode in a carrier in the truck bed, calm and alert, as if sensing the importance of the day. When Tom opened the carrier at the trailhead, the bird hopped out onto his gloved hand and looked around with keen interest, taking in the altitude, the thin air, the vast expanse of sky that opened above them. The hike to the cliff edge took 30 minutes, following a rocky trail that switchbacked through pine forest before emerging onto a granite outcropping that jutted out over the valley. The view was stunning, miles of mountains and meadows, the silver thread of the river far below, and everywhere the sense of space and freedom that made Tom understand why eagles chose these heights for their homes. They found evidence of nests in the cliff face below them, massive structures of branches wedged into crevices in the rock. Hope called out when they reached the edge, a piercing cry that echoed off the mountain and was answered moments later by another eagle soaring far above. Tom's breath caught. The mother, perhaps, or another of Hope's family, recognizing the call and responding. Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "It's time, Tom." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked to the very edge of the cliff. The drop was significant. Hundreds of feet of empty air before the slope began again below, perfect for a bird learning to trust its wings, to remember that falling and flying were sometimes the same thing. Hope shifted on the glove, wings partially spread, body tense with readiness. Tom felt the weight of the bird, so much heavier now than that broken chick had been, solid with muscle and health and life. He'd done this. He'd saved this magnificent creature, and now he had to give it back to the world it came from. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "These 2 months with you, they saved me. I was drowning in grief, drowning in the absence of my wife, and I'd forgotten how to feel anything but that loss. Then your mama dropped you at my feet, and suddenly I had a reason to wake up, a reason to care, a reason to hope." He paused, the word hanging in the cold air between them. "That's why I named you that. Because you gave me back something I thought was gone forever." Hope chirped, a softer sound than its usual cry, almost gentle. Tom stroked its head one last time, memorizing the feel of those feathers, the warmth of the bird's body, the way it leaned slightly into his touch. Doc Harlan moved closer, his weathered face kind. "You ready, Tom?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." He took a breath, then lifted his arm and tossed Hope into the air. the motion practiced from weeks of training, but feeling entirely different now. This was the last time. This was goodbye. For a heartbeat, hope fell, wings tucked, and Tom's heart stopped. Then the wings exploded open, catching air, and hope was flying, really flying, not the glides across the living room or the tethered circles in the meadow, but true free flight in open sky. The bird climbed, powerful strokes carrying it higher and higher, and Tom watched with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. Hope circled above them, riding the thermals with an ease that proved the wing had healed completely, that all the worry and care had been worth it. Tom wanted the bird to simply fly away, to disappear into the mountains and resume the life that had been interrupted by injury and human intervention. That would be the clean ending, the one that made narrative sense. But hope didn't fly away. Instead, the bird circled back, descending in a long spiral, and landed on Tom's shoulder with a gentleness that belied its size and strength. The talons gripped firmly but carefully, not breaking skin, and Hope leaned forward to nuzzle Tom's cheek with its beak, making that soft churring sound that meant contentment, that meant home. Tom stood frozen, overwhelmed, feeling the weight of the bird on his shoulder and the weight of emotion in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Hope was supposed to leave, to choose the wild over the man who'd healed it. But the bird was choosing differently, was saying goodbye in its own way, was giving Tom a gift he hadn't known he needed. Sarah was crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth. Doc Harlan had pulled off his glasses to wipe his eyes. Even Pete, who'd driven up quietly and was standing at the back of their small group, had tears tracking down through his beard. The moment stretched, perfect and painful, and more beautiful than anything Tom had experienced since Emma died. Then Hope lifted its wings, launched from his shoulder, and this time when it flew away, it kept going, climbing higher and higher until it joined the eagle still circling above them, the two birds calling to each other in voices that carried across the mountain. Tom watched until they were just specks against the blue, then gone entirely, disappeared into the vastness they belonged to. He stood there with his arms still raised, as if the weight of Hope's departure had frozen him in place, and he let himself feel everything, the loss and the love and the gratitude and the grief and the joy, all of it mixed together in a tangle that felt remarkably like being fully alive. She knew, he whispered. The mother eagle knew exactly what she was doing. The drive home from the cliff was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they'd witnessed. Sarah and Doc followed in their vehicles, planning to stop at the cabin for coffee and companionship, understanding that Tom might need company after such a profound moment. But when they pulled up to the house, Pete was already there, sitting on the porch steps with something wrapped in cloth on his lap. Tom climbed out of the truck slowly, his body feeling the weight of the morning, the emotional exhaustion that came from opening yourself that completely. Pete stood as they approached, his expression serious in a way Tom had rarely seen. "Need to show you something," Pete said. "Found it this morning when I was cleaning out the back storage room at the store. Been meaning to organize that space for years, and today just felt like the day." He held out the cloth-wrapped bundle. "This was left for you. Instructions said not to give it to you until something like what happened today." Tom took the bundle, recognizing the fabric immediately. It was one of Emma's quilting squares, the pattern she'd been working on the last year of her life. His hands shook as he unwrapped it, revealing a worn leather journal and an envelope with his name written in Emma's distinctive handwriting. The world seemed to tilt. Sarah steadied him with a hand on his arm, guiding him to sit on the porch steps. Doc and Pete flanked him, silent support, as Tom stared at his wife's handwriting with an expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief. "When did how long has this been at the store?" Pete's voice was gentle. "She brought it in 2 weeks before she passed. Made me promise not to give it to you until you'd found something to care for again, something living that needed you. Said I'd know when the time was right." He paused. "When Sarah mentioned the eagle, I knew. Tom's fingers trembled as he opened the envelope, pulling out pages covered in Emma's familiar script. The date at the top was from 3 years ago, written during her final days. He had to stop twice to wipe his eyes before he could focus enough to read. Asterisk, my dearest Tom. Asterisk. Asterisk. If Pete has given you this, it means you've finally let yourself care for something again. I'm so proud of you, and so relieved. I worried about you most in those final weeks, worried that losing me would break something in you that couldn't be repaired. Asterisk. Asterisk. I need to tell you about the Eagles, Tom. You might think what happened to you was chance, but I don't believe in that kind of coincidence. Let me explain. Asterisk. Asterisk. During my last year, when I was still well enough to walk the property, I discovered an eagle's nest in the North Ridge. A golden eagle, fierce and beautiful, with chicks that season. I'd sit and watch them for hours, those precious hours when the pain wasn't too bad, and I could still pretend things might turn out differently. Asterisk. Asterisk. I started bringing offerings, fish from the freezer, meat scraps, leaving them near the nest. The mother learned to trust me. I'd talk to her, Tom, tell her about you, about us, about my fears for what would happen after I was gone. It sounds crazy, I know, but she'd listen, tilting her head the way birds do, and I swear she understood. Asterisk. Asterisk. I told her about your kindness, about how you'd spent your whole life taking care of things, the land, the animals, me. I told her you were going to need something to care for when I was gone, something that needed you as much as I did, something that would force you to keep living instead of just existing. Asterisk. Asterisk. The eagles came back this year, Tom. I know because I asked Doc to check on them after I was gone, and he confirmed they nested in the same spot. I don't know if it's the same mother I fed and talked to, but I think it is. Eagles mate for life and return to the same nesting sites. She remembered. Asterisk. Asterisk. I know how this sounds. I know you'll want to dismiss it as a dying woman's fancy, as coincidence and wishful thinking. But Tom, I knew you'd shut down after I died. I knew you'd lock yourself away with grief and guilt and all those feelings you're so good at hiding. I needed to do something, had to try to reach you even after I was gone. Asterisk. Asterisk. So I made a promise to that eagle. I told her that if anything happened to one of her chicks, if it needed help, to take it to you. To the man in the valley who'd understand that broken things can heal, that caring for something vulnerable makes you strong, not weak. Asterisk. Tom stopped reading, his vision blurred completely now, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been holding back for 3 years. Sarah put her arm around him, and Doc's hand settled on his shoulder, and Pete just stood nearby, witnessing and solid. When Tom could breathe again, he continued reading. Asterisk. You're probably crying, and that's good. You need to cry, Tom. You need to let yourself feel all of it, the love we had, the loss of losing me, the fear and the hope and everything in between. The eagle's gift wasn't just the bird, it was the permission to feel again. Asterisk. Asterisk. I want you to know something. These last years with you were the happiest of my life. Even sick, even dying, I was happy because I was with you. You gave me everything a person could want: devotion, laughter, purpose, home. I have no regrets, except that we didn't get more time. Asterisk. Asterisk. But you have more time, Tom. You have years ahead of you, and I don't want you to spend them frozen in grief. I want you to live, really live. Let yourself care about things. Let yourself love again if you find someone. Let yourself be part of the community instead of a ghost at its edges. Asterisk. Asterisk. The bird will teach you how to let go. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Loving something and then releasing it, trusting it to fly on its own. You'll have to do that with the eagle, and in doing it, maybe you'll learn to do it with me too. To hold the love we had without being imprisoned by the loss. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm not really gone, Tom. I'm in every sunrise over the mountains, in the whisper of wind through the meadow grass, in the memory of every kind thing you've ever done. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'm in the eyes of an eagle that learned to trust a dying woman's promise. Asterisk. Asterisk. Live for me. Love for me. Let yourself be happy again. Asterisk. Asterisk forever yours. Emma. Asterisk. Tom sat with the letter for a long time, reading it twice more, letting the words sink into the broken places that were finally beginning to heal. When he finally looked up, his friends were still there, patient and present, and their faces showed that they understood what this meant. She knew, he said, his voice raw but steady. She knew everything that would happen. She made it happen. Sarah shook her head slowly, wonder in her expression. Or she asked for help, and the universe answered. Does it matter which? It didn't, Tom realized. What mattered was that Emma had loved him enough to reach beyond death, to arrange a healing she wouldn't be there to witness. What mattered was that a mother eagle had honored a dying woman's request and brought her injured chick to the one man who needed it most. What mattered was that hope had healed them both, bird and man, and that the healing was the point, not the keeping. He opened the journal next and found pages filled with Emma's observations of the eagles, sketches of the nest, notes about the mother's behavior. But he also found pages about him, things she wanted him to know, memories she wanted him to keep, hopes she had for his future. It was a gift beyond measure, this piece of her reaching forward through time. Doc cleared his throat gently. She was remarkable, Tom. We all knew it. But this is something else entirely. Tom nodded, carefully rewrapping the journal and letter. I need to go back to the cliff, need to thank that eagle properly if she's still around. We'll go with you, Sarah said. Tomorrow, when you're ready. Tonight, you rest. Let this settle. They stayed with him through the afternoon, making food he didn't eat, keeping company he needed, understanding that grief and gratitude could exist in the same space. When they finally left at dusk, Tom stood on the porch where he'd spent so many mornings with hope, Emma's letter pressed against his heart, and he spoke to the darkening sky. Thank you, Emma, for knowing what I'd need, for loving me enough to arrange a miracle. He paused, looking toward the mountains where hope was somewhere learning to be wild. And thank you, wherever you are, Mother Eagle. You kept your promise. You brought me hope. Tom spent that night reading Emma's journal cover to cover, each page revealing a side of his wife's final months he hadn't fully understood. She'd been preparing for her death with a grace he couldn't comprehend, making arrangements not just for the practical things, the will, the property, the medical directives, but for his emotional survival. The eagle was just one part of it, he realized. There were notes about conversations she'd had with Sarah, asking her to check on him, instructions left with Doc about staying present. Even Pete's monthly visits to bring supplies had been Emma's doing, a gentle insistence on community that she'd arranged before she lost the strength to arrange anything. The revelation was overwhelming. He'd spent 3 years thinking he was alone in his grief, carrying it like a burden only he understood, when in reality Emma had built a scaffold around him, a support system designed to catch him when he fell. And he had fallen so completely that he hadn't even recognized the hands reaching out to help. He woke before dawn, feeling hollowed out but strangely light, as if crying through the night had emptied something that needed emptying. He made coffee in the pale pre-dawn darkness and carried it to the porch, settling into the chair where hope used to perch. The ranch was quiet, the kind of deep silence that comes before the world wakes, and Tom found himself talking aloud to Emma in a way he hadn't allowed himself since her funeral. I was so angry with you, he said quietly, for leaving me, for dying. I know that's not fair. No, you didn't choose it, but I was angry anyway. And then I was angry at myself for being angry. And it ate me up inside until I couldn't feel anything at all. He took a sip of coffee, watching the stars fade. Hope changed that. Your eagle changed that. I can feel again, Emma. It hurts like hell sometimes, but I can feel, and I think that's what you wanted." The sky lightened gradually, the familiar transformation from darkness to dawn that he'd witnessed thousands of times but somehow felt new this morning. When the sun finally crested the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold, Tom made a decision. He needed to go back to the cliff, needed to see if the mother eagle was there, needed to close the circle Emma had opened. He called Sarah before breakfast, and she answered on the second ring despite the early hour. "I'm going back to the cliff today. Want to come?" "Absolutely. Give me an hour to feed my stock and I'll be there." Doc Harlan agreed to come as well, and by 8 o'clock they were back on the dirt road, climbing into the high country, this time with Emma's journal resting in Tom's lap and a sense of purpose that felt different from the bittersweet duty of yesterday's release. Yesterday had been about letting hope go. Today was about honoring the promise that had brought hope to him in the first place. The hike to the cliff was easier the second time, their bodies remembering the path, their breath more controlled in the thin air. When they reached the edge, Tom stood looking out over the valley and felt Emma's presence in a way he hadn't since those final days. Not a haunting, not a ghost, but a warmth in his chest that felt like love remembered and gratitude acknowledged. Sarah touched his arm gently. "What do you need to do here?" "Tom?" He'd been thinking about that all morning. "I need to thank her. The mother eagle. Emma asked her to do something almost impossible, to recognize me, to trust me, to bring her injured chick to a human when every instinct would say humans are danger. And she did it. She kept a promise to a dying woman." He pulled the journal from his jacket. "I want to leave this here. Part of it anyway." He'd marked a page the night before, one of Emma's entries about watching the eagles, about the beauty of their devotion to each other and their young. He tore it carefully from the journal, folded it, and placed it under a rock at the cliff edge, weighing it down against the wind. It felt right, returning Emma's words to the place where she'd found such peace in her final year. They'd been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes when Doc pointed to the sky. "Tom, look." 2 eagles were circling above them, riding thermals in graceful spirals. One was larger, clearly an adult, and the other, smaller, younger, with flight patterns that Tom recognized immediately. Hope, the bird, had returned to the area, and the adult eagle with it, mother or father, impossible to tell from this distance, was teaching it the thermals, the hunting patterns, the territory that would be its home. Tom's breath caught. To see Hope, wild and thriving, integrated back into the eagle's world so completely, was more than he'd dared hope for. But as they watched, both eagles descended, coming lower and lower, until they were circling just above the cliff edge, close enough that Tom could make out individual feathers, could see Hope's distinctive markings. The adult eagle called out, a piercing cry that echoed off the mountain, and Hope answered. Then, in a moment that Tom would remember for the rest of his life, Hope broke from the circle and dove straight toward them, wings tucked, plummeting in what looked like an attack before pulling up at the last second to land on the same rock where Tom had placed Emma's journal page. The bird stood there, fierce and beautiful, looking directly at Tom with those amber eyes that held recognition and something that felt remarkably like acknowledgement. Then Hope did something extraordinary. It bowed its head, a gesture that in the eagle world meant submission or respect, but in this moment felt like gratitude. Sarah gasped. Doc stood frozen, his medical mind probably trying to rationalize what they were witnessing, but his heart, clearly understanding it, didn't need rationalization. Tom stepped forward slowly, carefully, until he was close enough to reach out, though he didn't. Instead, he spoke, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break it. "Thank you for everything you taught me. Thank you for letting me help heal you. Thank you for helping heal me." He paused, then addressed the larger eagle still circling above. "And thank you, Mother, for keeping your promise to my wife, for bringing me hope when I needed it most, for trusting me with something you loved." Hope straightened, spread its magnificent wings once, and launched back into the air, climbing to rejoin the adult eagle. Together they soared higher, calling to each other, before wheeling away toward the peaks and disappearing from view. Tom stood watching the empty sky for a long time, feeling the weight of the past 3 years settling into something he could carry, not forgetting Emma, never that, but holding her memory in a way that allowed for present and future rather than just past. The grief would always be there, he understood that now, but it didn't have to be the only thing. There was room for joy too, for connection, for the small daily miracles that made life worth living. That bird just said goodbye, Doc said quietly. Really said goodbye, in a way that animals aren't supposed to be capable of. Emma would say it's because animals are more capable than we give them credit for, Tom replied. That we're the ones with limitations, not them. They started the hike back down in a silence that felt comfortable rather than heavy. Tom found his thoughts turning to practical matters, the ranch that needed work, the community he'd been avoiding, the life that stretched ahead of him, still full of possibility despite the losses behind him. He thought about Emma's wishes for him, her hope that he'd live fully rather than just survive, and he made a promise to himself to try. When they reached the trailhead, Sarah turned to him with a question in her eyes. "What now, Tom? What comes next?" He considered for a moment, looking back up the mountain where hope was somewhere learning to be wild, where Emma's words rested under a rock at the cliff edge, where a mother eagle had kept an impossible promise. "I think I start living again, really living, the way Emma wanted. I think I say yes to things instead of no. I think I stop hiding behind grief and start honoring her memory by being the person she fell in love with, someone who cares, who helps, who's part of something bigger than himself." Doc nodded approval. "That sounds like a good plan." "There's a town meeting next week about the community center renovations," Sarah added. "They could use someone with your building skills and your perspective." Tom almost refused out of habit, but caught himself. "I'll be there. Might even volunteer for the committee if they'll have me." Sarah's smile was bright enough to rival the sun. "They'll have you, Tom. We've all been waiting for you to come back." The drive home felt different than the drive up had, lighter somehow, despite the emotional weight of what they'd witnessed. Tom kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the mountains receding behind them, thinking about eagles and promises and the mysterious ways that love persisted beyond death. Emma had reached forward through time to save him, and a wild bird had honored that request, and somehow it had all worked exactly as it needed to. When he pulled up to the cabin, he noticed the porch seemed less lonely, the house less like a shrine and more like a home. He'd need to make changes, he realized. Not erasing Emma, but making space for present alongside past. Maybe it was time to finish that quilt she'd started, or finally paint the bedroom, or plant the garden she'd always wanted in the side yard. That evening, Tom sat on the porch with Emma's journal open to a page near the end, where she'd written about hope, the concept, not the bird, though it felt prophetic now. Asterisk, hope isn't about knowing everything will be fine. Asterisk, she'd written. Asterisk, it's about trusting that meaning will come even from the hardest things. It's about believing that broken can become whole, that endings can lead to new beginnings, that love persists even when the beloved is gone. I have hope for you, Tom. Hope that you'll find your way back to joy. Hope that you'll remember our love without being trapped by it. Hope that you'll fly again. Asterisk. Tom closed the journal carefully and looked up at the evening sky, where somewhere eagles soared and his wife's love lingered in the spaces between stars. "I'm flying, Emma," he said softly. "Finally, I'm flying." The town meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in the community center's main hall, and Tom arrived early, parking in a spot he hadn't used in 3 years. He sat in his truck for a moment, watching people file in through the double doors, recognizing faces he'd avoided since Emma's funeral. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, old instincts telling him to drive away, to retreat back to the safety of isolation. Then he thought of hope launching from the cliff, thought of Emma's words about flying, and he opened the truck door before he could change his mind. The hall smelled like coffee and old wood, and the particular scent of community people gathered together for shared purpose. Heads turned as he entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence, and Tom felt the weight of 3 years' absence in those stares. But then Pete stood from the front row, his face breaking into a wide smile, and the moment shifted. "Tom Brennan, as I live and breathe, get up here. We need your expertise." Others echoed the greeting: Martha Chen from the library, John Reeves, who ran the feed store, Reverend Williams from the church Emma had loved. Their welcome was genuine, uncomplicated by pity or judgment, and Tom felt something in his chest unclench. These were his people, had always been his people, and he'd been the one who left, not them. He took a seat near Sarah, who squeezed his hand briefly in support, and the meeting began. They were discussing renovations to the aging community center, new roof, updated kitchen, handicap accessibility improvements. The estimates were overwhelming, the budget insufficient, and the various proposed solutions grew more creative and desperate as the evening progressed. Tom listened quietly for the first hour, relearning the rhythms of group discussion, the way debates circled and returned, the mixture of pragmatism and hope that drove small-town problem-solving. Then John mentioned the possibility of doing much of the labor themselves to save costs, and several people immediately protested that they didn't have the skills for such complex work. Tom found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to speak. "I can help with that." The room went quiet. Pete nodded encouragement, and Tom continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "I've got 30 years of construction experience from keeping the ranch running. I can handle roofing, framing, electrical if needed. And I can teach others who want to learn. We could organize work parties, weekends, get it done in stages." Martha Chen leaned forward, her expression hopeful. "You'd really be willing to coordinate that, Tom? It would save us thousands in contractor fees." He thought about Emma's journal, about her hope that he'd be part of something bigger than himself. "I'd be honored to. We can start with a survey of who has what skills, who can commit what time, make a realistic timeline, do it right." The energy in the room shifted immediately from discouraged to possible. People began volunteering skills, time, resources. Someone offered scaffolding equipment. Another had connections to a roofing supplier who might give them a discount. The project that had seemed impossible 20 minutes ago suddenly had shape and momentum. After the meeting ended, Tom found himself surrounded by people thanking him, welcoming him back, sharing their own stories of loss and recovery. He learned that Martha had lost her husband 2 years prior, that John was caring for his mother with dementia, that nearly everyone in the room carried grief of some kind, but had found ways to keep living anyway. Reverend Williams pulled him aside as the crowd thinned. "Emma would be so proud of you tonight, Tom. Stepping up like this, offering yourself to the community. That's the man she married." Tom's throat tightened. "I forgot how to be that man for a while. Grief does that, makes us forget ourselves. But you're remembering now, and that's what matters." The Reverend paused. "I heard about the eagle, about Emma's journal. That's quite a story." "It's a miracle," Tom said quietly. "I don't know what else to call it. Maybe miracles are just love finding a way to persist. Emma's love for you, your love for that bird. All of it connected in ways we can't fully understand, but can be grateful for." Reverend Williams smiled. "Come by the church sometime. Not for counseling or anything formal. Just coffee. I'd like to hear the whole story, if you're willing to share it." Tom nodded, surprised to find he was willing. The story didn't feel private anymore. It felt like something worth sharing, something that might help others who were struggling to find their way back from loss. He left the meeting with a notebook full of plans, a phone full of new contacts, and a sense of purpose that felt both familiar and new. This was who he'd been before grief had frozen him, someone who built things, who solved problems, who contributed. Emma had seen that person worth saving, and hope had helped him remember how. Driving home under a sky full of stars, Tom thought about the work ahead, the community center project, the connections to rebuild, the life to be lived. It wouldn't always be easy. Grief would still ambush him sometimes, Emma's absence would still ache. But now he had tools to navigate those moments, and people willing to walk beside him, and the knowledge that healing was possible, even when it seemed impossible. He was flying now, really flying, and the sky ahead was full of light. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning bright with early December sun, Tom stood on the roof of the community centre with a hammer in his hand and a sense of rightness he hadn't felt in years. Around him, a dozen volunteers worked on various tasks, pulling old shingles, checking rafters, hauling supplies. The air was filled with the sounds of construction and conversation, laughter, and the occasional good-natured argument about the best way to tackle a problem. Sarah appeared at the top of the ladder, bringing fresh coffee in a thermos. "How's it looking up here?" "Good. Better than good. We'll have this section done by end of day if the weather holds." Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, taking a moment to survey the valley spread below them. From this height, he could see his ranch to the north, the mountains beyond, the vast sky where eagles soared. "You've done an amazing thing here, Tom," Sarah said quietly. "Brought the whole community together. Given people purpose." He shook his head. "I just offered to help. Everyone else did the rest." "No, you did more than that. You showed up. You let yourself be vulnerable, let people see that you needed this as much as we needed you. That's leadership. That's courage." Before Tom could respond, a shout came from below. Pete was pointing at the sky, his face lit with excitement. "Tom, look!" Tom turned, shading his eyes, and his breath caught. 2 eagles were circling above the community centre, one noticeably larger than the other. Even from this distance, he recognized Hope's flight pattern, the way the bird banked and turned. The young eagle was hunting, Tom realized, watching the meadow beside the building with intense focus. And the mother eagle, because Tom was certain now that's who the larger bird was, flew protective circles nearby, teaching and guarding in equal measure. Work stopped as everyone watched the eagles. Hope suddenly tucked its wings and dove, disappearing into the tall grass before emerging moments later with something clutched in its talons. The successful hunt drew cheers from the volunteers below, and Hope called out in what sounded remarkably like triumph before flying toward the mountains with its prize. But before disappearing completely, Hope circled back one final time, passing directly over the community centre low enough that Tom could see every detail: the powerful wings, the sharp gaze, the confidence of a bird fully healed and completely wild. The eagles screamed once, a piercing cry that echoed across the valley, and Tom understood it for what it was. A farewell, a thank you, a promise that healing was possible for all broken things. "That's your eagle, isn't it?" Martha Chen asked from the ground, wonder in her voice. "The one everyone's been talking about?" Tom nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched until Hope was just a speck against the mountain, then gone completely, and he felt Emma's presence so strongly it was almost physical. She was here, in this moment, in this gathering of community, in the evidence that love could transcend death and time and every boundary that tried to contain it. He climbed down from the roof carefully, his body remembering its age even as his spirit felt younger than it had in years. At ground level, people gathered around him, asking questions about Hope, about the mother eagle, about Emma's journal, and the impossible promise that had been kept. Tom found himself telling the story, all of it, from the moment Hope fell at his feet to the journal's revelation to this morning's goodbye. When he finished, Reverend Williams spoke for everyone. "That's a story about grace, Tom, about how love finds a way even when we think all ways are closed. Your Emma knew you'd need help grieving, so she arranged for help. That eagle knew her chick needed you, so she brought it, and you knew the bird needed to fly free, so you let it go. That's grace operating at every level." Tom pulled Emma's ring from his pocket, still carried close, but differently now. Not as a weight, but as a reminder. "I think I'm ready to let her rest. Really rest. Not forget her, never that, but stop holding so tight to the grief that I can't hold anything else." Sarah's eyes were wet. What will you do with the ring? He'd been thinking about that since the morning on the cliff. I'm going to have it made into a pendant, something I can wear but also take off when I need to. Something that honors her without keeping me trapped. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, these people who'd waited patiently for him to rejoin the living. She wanted me to be part of this, part of community, part of life. I'm ready now. The work resumed, but something had shifted. Tom felt it in the way people moved around him, the easy companionship, the sense that he belonged here not just as a worker, but as a member of something larger than himself. He'd been alone for so long, by choice and by grief, and now he was remembering what it meant to be connected. That evening, as the sun set and the volunteers packed up their tools, Tom stood in the community center doorway looking at the progress they'd made. The roof was nearly complete, the structure sound, the whole building transformed by cooperative effort and shared vision. It felt like a metaphor for his own healing, broken, then carefully repaired, now stronger than before. He'd lost Emma. That truth would never change, and the ache of it would never fully disappear. But he'd also found hope, and through hope had found his way back to himself. The eagle had taught him that healing was possible, that broken wings could mend, that flying again after falling was the bravest and most necessary thing a creature could do. As he drove home under a darkening sky, Tom spoke aloud to Emma one last time. I'm okay now, really okay. You can rest, my love. Your work is done. And somewhere in the mountains, an eagle soared free, carrying with it the prayers of a dying woman and the gratitude of a man who'd learned to fly again. Spring came to Boulder Valley with its usual dramatic flourish, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, snowmelt swelling the creeks, and eagles returning to their nests in the high cliffs. Tom stood on his porch in the early morning light, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up around him. 6 months had passed since hope flew free, and the man standing here now bore little resemblance to the frozen, grief-locked person he'd been. The pendant rested against his chest under his shirt, Emma's ring remade into something he could carry differently. He'd had the jeweler add a small stone amber, the color of Hope's eyes, and now when he touched it through the fabric, he thought of both the love he'd lost and the love that had saved him. The grief hadn't disappeared. He still missed Emma with an ache that could catch him off guard, still found himself turning to share something with her before remembering she wasn't there. But the grief had softened into something he could live with, something that coexisted with joy rather than excluding it. The community center renovation had been completed in February, ahead of schedule and under budget, thanks to the volunteer labor Tom had organized. The dedication ceremony had drawn nearly the entire town, and when they'd asked Tom to cut the ribbon, he'd done so with Sarah and Doc on either side of him, Pete grinning from the front row, and a sense that Emma would have loved seeing her isolated husband surrounded by community. He'd stayed involved after the project finished, serving on committees, helping with other town initiatives, slowly rebuilding the connections he'd severed in grief. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when solitude felt safer than company, when the ranch seemed like the only place he could breathe. But those days were fewer now, and when they came, he had people who understood, who'd call to check on him, who'd stop by with coffee, who'd give him space, but not abandonment. Sarah had become a regular fixture in his life, though neither of them had defined exactly what that meant. They had dinner together twice a week, worked side by side on ranch projects, sat on the porch in comfortable silence watching sunsets. There was affection there. Maybe even love of a different kind than what he'd had with Emma, but they were taking it slow, letting it develop naturally, without pressure or expectation. Emma would have approved, he thought. She'd have wanted him to find companionship, to not spend his remaining years alone. The ranch itself had changed too. Tom had finally tackled projects he'd been avoiding, painted the bedroom a warm gold color Emma had always wanted, planted the garden she'd planned but never seen, updated the kitchen with new appliances that made cooking feel less like duty and more like choice. He'd kept her quilts, her books, her presence woven into the house's fabric, but he'd also made space for new things, new memories, the ongoing life that honored her by living fully rather than by preservation. Doc Harlan pulled up the drive just after 7, his weekly coffee visit now a cherished tradition. They sat on the porch, Tom in Emma's old chair and Doc in the newer one Tom had built last month, and talked about everything and nothing, the price of cattle, the weather, the upcoming town picnic. "Saw an eagle yesterday," Doc mentioned casually, "out near the North Ridge. Young one, hunting. Had a distinctive flight pattern." He paused. "Reminded me of hope." Tom smiled. Could have been. Eagles return to their territory. Hope would be old enough to establish a hunting range by now. "Think you'll see it again?" "Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter much either way." Tom took a sip of coffee, considering. "Hope served its purpose, taught me what I needed to learn. If it comes back around, I'll be grateful. If it stays wild and distant, I'll be grateful for that too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Doc cleared his throat. "Emma would be proud of you, Tom. The way you've rebuilt your life, opened yourself back up. It took real courage." "Had good help," Tom replied, "from a dying woman and a wild bird and friends who wouldn't let me disappear completely." He touched the pendant under his shirt. "I think that's what love does. It persists. Changes form, finds new channels, but persists. Emma's love became hope, and hope's healing became this me, here, alive and grateful." Pete's truck appeared on the road, followed by Sarah's, and Tom realized with pleased surprise that he'd forgotten he'd invited them all for breakfast. Not forgotten in the way grief had made him forget things, but forgotten in the way people do when life is full enough that details slip by. He'd made biscuits earlier, had bacon ready to fry, coffee already hot. They gathered around the kitchen table, the 4 of them who'd been present for Hope's arrival and departure, who'd witnessed the transformation and supported it. They talked and laughed, told stories, made plans for summer projects. It was ordinary and extraordinary, this simple gathering of friends, this evidence that Tom had rejoined the world of the living. After they left, Tom walked out to the meadow where Emma's ashes had been scattered 3 years before. The grass was high and green, studded with lupine and Indian paintbrush, and somewhere in the distance he heard an eagle's cry. He didn't look up to see if it was hope. It didn't need to be. The lesson had been learned, the healing accomplished. "I'm okay, Emma," he said quietly. "More than okay. I'm living, really living, the way you wanted. Thank you for the eagle. Thank you for loving me enough to plan my rescue. Thank you for everything." The wind picked up, warm and gentle, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and Tom could have sworn he heard Emma's laugh in it, that joyful sound that had first caught his attention 45 years ago at a county fair. She was here and not here, gone and present, memory and blessing. He walked back to the house with a lightness in his step, plans forming for the day ahead, fence to mend, garden to tend, community to serve, life to live. A life that honored loss by refusing to be diminished by it, that carried grief and joy in equal measure, that had been broken and healed and was now stronger for the fracture. In the mountains, eagles soared. On the ranch, a man who'd learned to fly again went about the beautiful ordinary work of being alive. And somewhere in the space between earth and sky, a dying woman's love and a wild bird's gift had woven together into something that looked remarkably like grace. Hope had come, and hope remained, not as a bird now, but as a way of being, and Tom carried it forward into whatever days remained, grateful for every single one.